From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
We don't need a lot of new laws to get social justice in America. We need to honor, essentially, the laws we already have. If all men are equal, that is final. It's restful. About the Declaration, there is something that is exceedingly restful. So he brought Americans back to the memory that the foundation of our country had all we need for a good life. Perhaps newer laws are superfluous. Very interesting.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Amity Shlaes, chair of the Coolidge Foundation and author of Coolidge, Forgotten Man. We'll talk a bit about Calvin Coolidge with her later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. Paul Moreno, William and Berniece Grewcock Chair in Constitutional History, Professor of History, Dean of Social Sciences, and for our purposes today, a big-time baseball fan. It is the middle of winter. We could use a jolt of summer. Also, this past week, January 31st, way back in 1919, Jackie Robinson was born. I thought we'd talk with Dr. Moreno about Jackie Robinson, his life, his career, breaking the color barrier in baseball. Go back a little bit. Jackie Robinson, before baseball, before Major League Baseball, great athlete, multi-sport athlete. What, four
Yes,
at UCLA?
And again, he's one of the reasons that Branch Rickey chose him was that he was sort of a model character. He had just the perfect temperament to sort of run the gauntlet of being, crossing the color line, and met with a great deal of white resistance. There was an incipient rebellion among the Dodger players because of this, and so Robinson had the steel. Because Rickey told him, you're going to be in for a lot of harassment.
Yeah,
and you got to be willing to take it. We can't have somebody who's gonna explode.
Let's talk about that dynamic a bit. Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers, he's the one who decides that the Dodgers are going to integrate. The Dodgers are going to have a black baseball player. What was his reason? Why did he want to do that?
Yeah, that's one of the great sort of disputed questions among historians of the subject. Rickey was such a complicated character. He was a very devout Methodist. He had a sense of Christian brotherhood, which is probably very genuine. He probably saw this as, that segregation was a stain on the American escutcheon, wanted to do something about. He was also a really shrewd and sharp businessman who really was a transformative figure in sort of modern Major League Baseball. Basically invented the farm system that turned a small market team like the Cardinals into a powerhouse. He was also notoriously really cheap with his players. He was quite a character. But he recognized that blacks were, both the potential to get black players to make your team better so people will come out and see the games, and also to tap into the black audience, that he saw sort of the Negro leagues and the separate sort of captive market, which existed in every segregated market in America, as something that he could profit by. And when baseball was interesting, because in 1947, when it integrated, it was really one of the first major American institutions to do so. And baseball at the time, dominated American sports in a way nothing like it is today, where it really had no competition from professional sports of any other kind. It really was the American pastime. And so integrating that institution probably was more important than a lot of the civil rights legislation that was coming along at the same time. And, baseball had actually been integrated in the 19th century. Technically speaking, there were a couple of brothers, Weldy and Fleetwood Walker in the 19th century, who played for a Toledo team, which was at the time a major league team. Toledo's always been kind of a major league AAA team. And at the behest of the white players, principally, they were driven out of the major leagues. The players forced the owners to first adopt a cap as, one or five black players per team, and then exclude them entirely, because the white players wanted to monopolize the jobs in baseball. And since baseball is a monopoly or a cartel, and the only legally protected one in the United States, they were able to do that. So Rickey had to sort of take on the other owners, all of whom were opposed to integration. The players by the 1940s had pretty much gotten over this. They were divided about this, but the majority of players probably said, want to open the game to African Americans.
When it comes to Jackie Robinson, the players, Jackie Robinson, after his military service, plays for the Negro Leagues, Kansas City Monarchs. And he was a very good player, not the best player. Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, you had other players who might have been more talented. So why did Branch Rickey target Jackie Robinson to be this player?
Also, to do this in Brooklyn at the time, to bring him up through the Dodgers farm system, because New York had a large black population. Again, the integration of the major leagues almost immediately after the Dodgers were integrated, the Cleveland Indians were the first American League team to integrate. And, the American demographic was changing. This is the great migration of the two world wars. Blacks have been moving into American cities in large numbers. And so, it's probably an indication that Rickey was aware of both the talent of black players like Robinson. Again, you had to get, the right ones. He had to, believe it or not, he had to get over the sense that a lot of people had that blacks couldn't play the game as well as whites. People still believe this, even though very quickly, as soon as Major League Baseball integrated, blacks being about 12% of the population reached, more than that proportion of Major League talent. So, Robinson had to show it on the field that blacks were able to play the game as well as whites, when statistically speaking, they were able to play the game better than whites. But that was the popular prejudice that he had to overcome.
The Negro Leagues, how did they sort of set the stage for Robinson's career? Did they help prove that, in fact, that black players could play?
Well, yes, because whenever you had sort of informal, sort of pickup and barnstorming competitions, black players often dominated. Especially, you mentioned Satchel Paige. He performed some incredible feats against white batters. So again, people who really knew the game probably didn't share the popular prejudice about this. And the problem with the Negro Leagues, though, was there was a vested interest that blacks had in a separate league. The people who benefited from the integration of Major League Baseball were white owners like Branch Rickey, whose teams were improved and were profitable. The black players, who the Negro Leagues were underpaid and sort of ramshackle, they got better salaries and better working conditions. But the people who suffered from it were, of course, the marginal white players who were only in the major leagues because blacks were excluded and didn't have to compete with them, but also the black owners of the Negro League teams. Then again, this was true in every segregated enterprise, where black entrepreneurs, black business owners had kind of a captive market because whites wouldn't serve them, but blacks were willing to pay the price, that sort of economic price of losing some of their ownership benefits for the larger opportunities that came in an integrated national market.
Talking with Dr. Paul Moreno about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball. April 15th, 1947, Robinson's first game with the Dodgers as a 28-year-old. He'd win Rookie of the Year in his first year, I think the very first year of the Rookie of the Year award in Major League Baseball. Tell us a little bit, what kind of a player was Jackie Robinson?
He was a five-tool player, as I say today. He could do everything. He was an exciting player, too. The speed on the base paths, especially the number of times that he stole home. Again, he did take the Brooklyn Dodgers, almost overnight from, a decent team to a, really predominant team, a team that could challenge the Yankees regularly in the postseason. So he did. And again, this is part of what Branch Rickey had in mind, that it would improve the quality of the team. It would make the Dodgers contenders and would increase attendance, and then again all of the other elements that flow from that. So he did exactly what economists say that players should do. He added marginal value to the Dodgers, much more than what he was being paid by Branch Rickey, or that he would have been paid by anybody else as well, because this is a period where you still had the reserve clause, which later black players like Curt Flood likened to slavery, in which the best players especially were underpaid relative to what they contributed to the team. And Rickey was a great defender of the reserve clause and was well aware that he was getting more than his money's worth when he signed Jackie Robinson.
Ask about the reaction, I guess, from two main groups, the fans. We certainly know that there were some threats, there were taunts. How did the fans react to Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier? And then players. Yeah. There's this semi-famous story that may or may not have happened about Pee Wee Reese coming over and putting his arm around Jackie Robinson in sort of a message to others. This guy was okay. This guy was a player. He's a baseball player. How did the fans react? How did the other players react?
Yeah, the player reaction, Dixie Walker was a well-known outfielder on the Dodgers, and he was sort of the team captain. He was also sort of the representative of a kind of players association. It wasn't a union. The players weren't unionized yet, but insofar as they had an organization to talk with management Dixie Walker, who was, I think, from Alabama, was the head of it. And he tried to lead sort of a boycott of the players, saying, we're not going to play with blacks. And because the players weren't unionized, Ricky and others like, other players who supported this were able to nip that in the bud. So players didn't have control over, who could enter the player ranks. The other important part of this is the other owners didn't. Ricky faced opposition from the owners of the other teams, but really there was nothing they could do to stop him. It was his team. Mm-hmm. And so he had the kind of, authority to deal with both the players and the other owners to do this. There are stories that a couple of earlier managers, especially Bill Veeck, who was and that's another version of a kind of real innovative entrepreneurial kind of owner, that Veeck had plans to buy, I think it was the Cleveland Indians, and to stock them with black talent as a way of turning them around. But that story's been controverted among historians.
Now, just getting to play with the Dodgers and proving himself against other players was not it, because there were other hurdles, right? In terms of travel, in terms of accommodations. Right. Jackie Robinson couldn't stay in the same hotels with the rest of his players, with the rest of his teammates. Yeah,
and although this is sort of Washington and St. Louis would be the only cities that were still in segregated states. Ironically enough, at the time, baseball was almost still entirely upper Midwestern and Northeastern. That would have been a bigger problem later on. It would have been a bigger problem in the minor leagues, especially where you had Southern teams. But yes, that was a problem for, of course, diplomats from other countries staying in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that in the 1960s drove the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But baseball was able to do this where they were able to say to, we're not going to play, we're not going to participate in cities that don't respect our players. They had the power to do that.
Robinson, of course, proves to be the right choice. Multiple All-Star, MVP of the league in 1949, ended up winning a World Series in 1956, and I believe his final year in baseball, the Yankees kept getting in their way. The Dodgers way.
55, the Dodgers finally won, yes. And in 56, the Yankees took it back.
I was going to ask about his legacy. I think that's relatively clear.
Number 42 has now been retired from every team.
That's right.
There's Jackie Robinson Day. And he's in many ways, because, sort of dealing with the race problem, which has been the central problem in all of American history, in the thing that, as I said, was the national pastime. The integration of baseball in 1947 really was a milestone in American history. And when you consider, too, at the time that, again, I said baseball was a monopoly. And since 1901, when the American League was formed, you had the same 8 teams and more or less the same 8 cities in each league. And the population of the United States kind of doubled or tripled in that time, and yet there was still the same number of jobs. So the competition to play in the big leagues was never more intense than it was, in 1947. And because 12% of the population had been excluded when you introduced blacks into the game, you had from 1947 until expansion in 1961, most people would say this was the golden age of baseball in American history. You never had a more talented body of people playing the game because you had now, at least within the American player market, the best players available without any racial restrictions.
In post-baseball career for Jackie Robinson, he was very interesting. He became a VP for Chalkful Nuts Coffee. He became, I believe, the first black national broadcaster for sports, for baseball games, and then died young. I believe the age of 54.
He did die young, and he was also a Republican. He supported the Republican Party, in sort of the Eisenhower years. And that's another good indication of the way in which sort of race relations were in flux in this period, because the Republican Party had been traditionally, the party of Lincoln, and blacks were, voted at pretty much 100% Republican where they could vote up until the New Deal. And then the black vote was in play. Part of what you see going on in baseball, where you had sort of competition for black consumers and for black players, was also taking place in politics in America, where both parties were appealing for the black vote. And that didn't really shake out the way that we know it today until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Robinson did sort of repudiate the Republican Party late in his life.
Dr. Paul Moreno, William and Berniece Grewcock Chair in Constitutional History, Professor of History, Dean of Social Sciences, big baseball fan. Yankees fan. Won't hold that against him. Dr. Moreno, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Up next, Amity Shlaes is with us, Coolidge expert. She wrote a recent essay, Coolidge and Us. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
The book of Exodus is one of the central narratives of the Bible. It recounts the moment when God rescues his people from slavery in Egypt and gives them the 10 Commandments to guide their moral and religious freedom. But how well do you actually know the story? In Hillsdale College's new, free online course, The Exodus Story, you'll learn the spiritual significance of the Old Testament's most epic book. In The Exodus Story, Hillsdale College professor of English, Justin Jackson, picks up the biblical narrative where his course on Genesis ended. Join Dr. Jackson in learning about the nature of God's mercy, human freedom, and the relationship between the divine and man. Discover the beauty of God reclaiming the Israelites through his mercy and love in The Exodus Story. To enroll today and secure your spot in this completely free online course, visit hillsdale.edu/new course. That's NEWCOURSE. hillsdale.edu/new course.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined now by Amity Shlaes. She is chair of the Coolidge Foundation. You can find more about them at coolidgefoundation.org. Also the author of the great book Coolidge, Forgotten Man. You can find a recent essay at nationalreview.com. Calvin Coolidge and Us. Amity, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Your book is called Forgotten Man, and this essay we're going to talk about today essentially runs to the point of Coolidge is being overlooked once again. I'm sure you're asked very often, but what is it about the man and his presidency that so often causes us to forget about him?
Americans like war presidents, and we believe war defines the presidency. Woodrow Wilson went into the war as a peace domestic policy person, and he became a war president, and that is by and large how we remember Woodrow Wilson. He negotiated World War I. Our memory of Franklin Roosevelt, who served many peacetime years, is defined by his leadership in World War II. He won the war, all else is forgiven, or all else looks pretty good. People don't rate Roosevelt, that would be Franklin, except for in terms of the war, really. Even when they rate him economically, they do that with an eye to the victories in Europe and Asia. So Coolidge was a peacetime president. He began service in 23. He left office in early 29. It makes him less exciting, and we have a kind of problem with the way we look at presidents, which is we rank them as if they were sports teams. And therefore, when one moves up, it's zero sum. Someone else has to move down. So when war presidents are moved up, Coolidge automatically moves down in the slot ranking of presidents. And that, therefore, perhaps definitely puts him lower than he deserves to be, because, of course, the job of the president, that which we should be ranking them on, includes the non-war challenges, the stewardship domestically of the president, as opposed to how a man performed if he did as commander-in-chief.
The theme of the essay, one of the themes of the essay, is how Coolidge had navigated challenges like we face today, but perhaps we first talk about how he became who he became. You say in the piece that 3 accidents of his early career turned him toward conservative constitutionalism. What were those accidents, and how do they influence Coolidge and his thinking and philosophy?
Well, absolutely, and this is very important for Hillsdale, particularly, where a university that does pay attention to this kind of thing, to the benefit of its culture and students. Normally, Republicans, for example, speak of Coolidge in favor of his tax cuts, which were tremendous for the U.S. economy, or other sort of technical achievements. But what I argue in this essay is that he was only able to pursue policy such as fiscal policy because of his view of the U.S. Constitution. And the 3 accidents were, one, Coolidge, let's say that Coolidge constitutional philosophy was conservative. He didn't believe the executive was king. He was rather presider in George Washington's sense. What made Coolidge able to believe that in a relatively modern time? One, he did not go to law school. And in law school, even then, at Harvard, where he would have gone, or Columbia, where he would have gone, judges were becoming more important. That is, they were becoming deciders, not just raters of cases. And there was the new progressive culture was changing the teaching of law, lifting the sights of lawyers instead of just writing wills. Lawyers were now supposed to change America, making them more, frankly, like ministers, that is, preachers and politicians. Coolidge missed that because he didn't go to law school. He read law as Abraham Lincoln had. His dad thought, this is awful expensive. I didn't even go to college myself. You can read law at my friend's office here in Vermont. His father was well known in Vermont and friendly with the political leaders and in the State House from time to time himself. And Coolidge said, no, I'll read law in Massachusetts, near where I went to college in Northampton, Mass., and then I'll sit the bar. But Coolidge did go the old-fashioned way and therefore missed the powerful culture of law school. And that's the first accident. The second accident, the second accident was that he entered politics from the bottom. He did not go to Davos before he ran for president. He didn't go to Versailles to write the treaty at the end of World War I, as did his friend Dwight Morrow, who had been with him at Amherst. He was a little politician in a little town and also a little practicing attorney, small-town attorney in Northampton, Massachusetts, which he called a city, by the way, and which was an extraordinarily exciting city in the day. It's not just where Smith College happens to be. So he encountered real businesses with real problems. At that time, there were many immigrant businesses in Western Massachusetts, and he became their lawyer because when you're a young lawyer and you're looking for clients, who do you find? The people who are so new they don't have a lawyer yet.
Right.
So he worked with many immigrants, German brewers, Irish people who founded new banks. That gave him an understanding for the challenges of day-to-day business that you would never have if you went from graduate school to graduate school and then to government.
Talking with Amity Shlaes about Calvin Coolidge, these three happy accidents. What about the third, Amity?
The third accident was TR, Theodore Roosevelt. In that period, Coolidge was a Republican. His family were Republicans. They had a sense of loyalty. Coolidge once said, kind of wryly, if nobody is partisan, nobody can be independent. That is, you free-riding independents who act as though you have more claim on morality than we cogs within the party are only able to make that claim because we are loyal. He believed in party loyalty and working behind the scenes. And what he observed, so Coolidge was born in 1872. So, he was in his 30s watching TR in his 20s. TR was president when he was a young man, observing TR. In 1912, TR, out of office, decided out of vanity to go back and run again as an independent bull moose, wrecked the Republican Party's prospects, even in Massachusetts, Coolidge's state, where he was running for office, which had been a Republican stronghold. So TR betrayed his party with that election, with a real political consequence. As a result, it was a three-party race, 1912. The main parties, there were three. And the Democrat won. The other side won, and put through progressive measures about which Coolidge was increasingly skeptical. And Theodore Roosevelt didn't care for the Constitution. This was the tragedy of the life of his friend William Howard Taft, right, the next president.
Right.
Theodore Roosevelt just wanted to get what he wanted to do done in the name of his morality, and everything else was detail. That drove Coolidge crazy. So he probably observed Taft very closely, and what Taft paid for this whole situation by losing himself that year. And DC was more like WHT than like TR. And he saw the costs of flamboyant populist leadership, and that made Coolidge all the more cautious when it came time for him to serve as U.S. president a bit later.
Talking with Amity Shlaes, her recent essay at nationalreview.com, Calvin Coolidge and Us. A couple of years after that 1912 election, Calvin Coolidge became president of the state senate, and he delivers a speech known as Have Faith in Massachusetts, and you call it one of the finest elucidations of federalism in existence. That's a big claim. What was this speech about, and what made it so unique in laying out the tenets of federalism?
Have Faith was a reaction to what was going on. Massachusetts was a powerhouse of progressivism, and Coolidge didn't like it that much. He was, the GOP, his party was progressive, but he didn't like it that much. So finally, he got the opportunity of this speech, Have Faith in Massachusetts. And he said, men do not make laws, they do but discover them. Whoa, that means our job is finding laws that already exist and implementing them, that is principles, in a way that is respectful. That's very different from we will change America through our own brilliant vision. Another thing he said was, I'm trying to think of the quote, but he said something to the effect that you can't help the weak by pulling down the strong. Class warfare is not productive. It might be fun and serve political productivity, but it doesn't serve the polity. You don't expect to help the weak by pulling down the strong. Those are two of the lines that stand out. So why is that constitutional? He's going back to the fathers who also saw limits to presidential power because they knew there was a power behind the presidency under which men lived, which was the power of God, the power of the divine, and that we on earth dare not do too much and take ourselves for gods. This was a real challenge, this speech, to not only TR but progressives in Coolidge's state, such as Louis Brandeis, who was now already in Washington, but was a big reformer and said, man must change everything. And Coolidge also, I think the limits of government in this, as displayed in the speech, are the most constitutional part of it. And I want to add an example that comes from just a few years later that relates. Through an amendment to the Constitution, the 18th, we got prohibition. That was followed by the Volstead Act from Congress, which implemented prohibition. This process is very important. First, the people say it's okay, then Congress writes a law because the people said it was okay under our Constitution, and that was the Volstead Act. And then the Volstead Act was reviewed by the High Court, a further check and balance event. And at that time, when a crowd that were, as mentioned, Coolidge's old clients, brewers in the state of Massachusetts, passed a near beer law. It was a very, no one knew where the lines would fall, sort of as with marijuana today. And they said, we can't make heavy proof beer, but we can make light beer, and that's constitutional. Let's do that. And this was lobbied for by people who might even have been formerly Coolidge's clients as an attorney. The beer industry, lovable beer brewers from Germany, helping America, had to do with their success, hung on their success in brewing. And now the government had this prohibition law that snuffed out their existence. So, but Coolidge, so you'd expect his constituents, Coolidge would sort of say, okay, near beer, it's kind of legal, I'm for it. He didn't. He vetoed the law permitting near beer. He said, wait for the Supreme Court to speak. It hasn't spoken. Offending his own constituents. I thought that was hilarious. It was a bit like Taft. It's quite risky because you can't offend too many voters or you'll be alone in your study practicing your constitutionalism, but you won't be an elected leader. So that was Coolidge. He really thought about the Constitution, and he studied it as a boy. His education wasn't cluttered the way ours is. He probably read for a few nights the Constitution when he was 13. And then again, because he had more to read and nothing else to look at. And he internalized it. Janice Rogers Brown, the former federal judge, says the same thing. She observes his internalization of it from age of 12, 13.
Amity, in the limited time we have together, we need to hop forward toward Coolidge's time as president. And you say a few times in this piece at National Review how often Coolidge points back toward the founders, points back toward the Declaration of Independence. How are Coolidge's successes in the White House directly influenced by those two things, the founders and the Declaration?
Well, the humility of the founders is evident in Coolidge's humility. When Warren Harding, the president, died, Coolidge became president, and he didn't say, I will define a new program as if he were Lyndon Johnson, Great Society in Michigan. He said, I will follow the orders I received. So the mandate that we have is a mandate given us by the people in the 1920 election because of their reflecting their enthusiasm for the 1920 GOP platform. So I will execute. And when you are clearly operating in service rather than in of the polity and the agreement, the contract with America, rather than your own in service of your own aggrandizement, people give you their political support. He got a lot of political credit because he had the humility of George Washington, and that enabled him to pass his tax cuts, which are dramatic. You know, in the Harding Coolidge period, as a result of commitment to that platform and commitment to the economy, our tax rate went from the 70% range to 25%, which is lower than Ronald Reagan. But you believe a man who clearly has committed himself to service rather than, I don't know, a fop, a party vain person. And so Coolidge won his bet. Traditional federalism worked. He gave a wonderful speech, which is important, and I know taught at Hillsdale, about the Constitution in 26, in which he said, we don't need a lot of new laws to get social justice in America. We need to honor, essentially, the laws we already have. If all men are equal, that is final. It's restful. About the Declaration, there is something that is exceedingly restful. So he brought Americans back to the memory that the foundation of our country had all we need for a good life. Perhaps newer laws are superfluous. Very interesting. And African Americans, for example, did fare better in the 20s. So the rate of, if you go into the data, you'll see the rate of lynching went down dramatically in the 20s. Why? Because the economy was better and because people were less angry. But I'll just say one more thing. Coolidge's final action as president didn't relate to economic policy or anything like that, but it was a policy decision and certainly affected the country greatly and restored a burnished presidency to respect. He could have run again in 28, but he chose not to, like George Washington, because a president is merely a presider. And as you said, it's better to change presidents from time to time. Otherwise, and here I paraphrase, the president becomes like a monarch and the presidency like a monarchy. And to not run for office when you're deeply popular, which Coolidge was, he was so popular, no one will believe it, but it's in the newspapers, that the sculptor of Mount Rushmore suggested one day that they put a bust of Coolidge up there with TR and Lincoln and Jefferson and Washington, if one can imagine. But he still didn't run. And that was an important legacy for us. He showed that one could act as Washington did, who also, of course, chose not to run again, even in an era with telephones, automobiles, and newspapers. So that was amazing. It was a hard decision because he was so popular. He hurt his party, but for very different reasons to the ones for which TR hurt his party.
Amity Shlaes with us. She is chair of the Coolidge Foundation. You can find more at coolidgefoundation.org. It seems like people, when they think of Coolidge, are pretty broken into two camps. Either they have not heard of him and don't know much about him at all, or they have and they love him deeply. What would you say about Coolidge, perhaps particularly how it pertains to our politics today, that might reach those people somewhere in the middle of those two extremes?
Well, we know today that we feel that politicians disappoint us.
Mm-hmm.
We watch a debate and we say, I don't like this candidate. And the real reason is the politicians appear to be not good men, but opportunists. And the media encourages that aspect of the politicians. The media say, that won't fly. I'll use it as an example. This is not an endorsement, but I'll use an example. Mike Pence really adores Coolidge and had his portrait in his office. Mike Pence has gone through things. He's been a governor and he's been a vice president in a very difficult period. He's a kind of profile in courage, as we say. But they say, the media will say, and then the voters follow that, he can't win. He's a loyalist. But actually, we value loyalists. Our media discourage loyalists. They look at politics as sort of some sports game. But that's what's going on. So those who understand that people are loyal, and Pence was loyal, again, to constitutional principle, not party, those loyalists, that we want to be loyal in that way. So that's, those who appreciate Coolidge do that. The media tell us that first impression matters most. When parties train new candidates, they haul them off to a resort and lecture them on the importance of the first impression. Coolidge was a third impression person. When you first met him, he seemed insignificant. He didn't talk. He wasn't a big man. He didn't smile. And people came to love him through experience. He wasn't a used car dealer who got you once and you never go back. That is still valued by Americans. We just need sort of to support our intuitive understanding more culturally. And Coolidge had that. And he's loved because he was a third impression person, because he validated the idea that we rate people on their whole lives, not on some snapshot.
Amity Shlaes, you can read her essay at nationalreview.com. Calvin Coolidge and Us. Also, find out more about the Coolidge Foundation at coolidgefoundation.org and her wonderful book, Coolidge, Forgotten Man. Amity, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Up next, we talk with D.G. Hart, professor of history here at Hillsdale College, as we continue our series on H.L. Mencken. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. You can get an email every time there's a new episode of this program. Go to radiohour.hillsdale.edu, click on subscribe, and enter your email address. That's radiohour.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by D.G. Hart. He is Associate Professor of History here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Hart, thanks for joining us.
Great to be back with you.
Continuing our conversations on H.L. Mencken, Dr. Hart's also written a book on Mencken, Damning Words, The Life and Religious Times of H.L. Mencken. We talked today about free speech and Mencken's proponents of free speech. Why was he such a fierce advocate of free speech? Why did he think it was so important for society?
Well, part of it goes to his ambivalent relationship to the United States. He's very critical of America in many ways, American people, critical of democracy. And maybe one of his worst books is Notes on Democracy. I think it's something like that. It doesn't hold up very well compared to some of his other books. Having said all that, he was a firm defender of the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights. And as a writer and as an editor, he saw that as basic. And it's hard for us to remember a time when there were obscenity laws still in the books. There were also activist groups that tried to prevent the circulation of material in the presses, that they could use various government restrictions or even mail service to have get their ends for their own purposes. And Mencken, highly aware of those sorts of restrictions, also Mencken being an agnostic, he was not an atheist. He said that would require too much certainty. But being an agnostic, he was up against a culture that was overwhelmingly Protestant, and Protestants, the so-called Protestant establishment, did run a large part of American institutions. Again, not with some kind of government sanction, but informally, they were very prominent, and Mencken thought of himself as an outsider. And I do believe that those legal protections that came with the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, was one way that he knew that he could sort of get through and be heard and help other people to be heard.
In 1926, he purposefully gets himself arrested in Boston trying to sell copies of the American Mercury in protest of policies that were laid out. What was his issue at the time with the Watch and Ward Society, and what was he trying to accomplish?
Well, the Watch and Ward Society objected to a short story in the American Mercury. I'm pretty sure it was a short story, not a journalistic report. The Mercury had a combination of both. And this is a guy who was named after one of the leading Methodists in the United States. His name was Asbury, was in the name of the author. But it was about a small town, and there was a prostitute in the town who would regularly service men in the town after Sunday evenings in the cemetery next to the church. And Protestants and others objected to this. This was going outside the lines. I've read the story. There's nothing inherently, especially by today's standards, objectionable about it. But in that climate, it was certainly racy. Even to write about prostitution, acknowledge it's out there, and maybe presenting the person somewhat sympathetically. So they wanted to shut it down. And the way they did that was to stop circulation in the mail. And Mencken's magazine had a second-class status. And if you were not regular in keeping your postage every month, you would lose that second-class status and maybe have to bump up to first, which would be much more expensive. And so that was one of the ways that they were trying to restrict this. And Mencken wanted to try to get this through the courts as quickly as possible, try to get the magazine back out in circulation as quickly as possible. And he also liked the show of it. He actually, the head of the Watch and Ward Society, whose name I forget right now, but he gives Mencken a coin to purchase it. It's probably a quarter or something, and Mencken bites it to make sure that it's real. He's playing for the cameras, etc. But he also has to go to court, and I think he's held in jail overnight. I mean, you're very modest, not a jail, but probably the cell within the police department building. Anyway, that's how that went, and it was dicey because it looked like they might actually succeed in stopping the publication. There was another effort the following issue to try to restrict it, but Mencken was able to get through and prevail. Through the courts, I think a judge finally interceded and said that the Watch and Ward Society's restrictions were illegitimate.
You mentioned that Mencken's agnostic. It seems that Mencken viewed religion as a barrier to freedom of speech and was particularly critical of Puritanism. What was his thinking?
Well, he used Puritanism as a stand-in word for the Protestant establishment. And it's somewhat ironic because Puritanism did not become the kind of study that mid-20th century Harvard, Yale academics would turn into a cottage industry in literary studies, in American history, colonial history, intellectual history. Puritans, as I mentioned, I think in the previous episode, Perry Miller was responsible for that. And Perry Miller had grown up reading the American Mercury and knew Mencken's take on the Puritans. And it wasn't simply in reaction to Mencken, but he did try to improve Puritanism, and he was very successful. Miller was very successful in doing that. But again, I think Mencken associated Puritanism with this Protestant world that elevated moralism over aesthetics. That was particularly galling to him when he did literary criticism. And there is some legitimacy in attributing to Puritanism because the Northeast establishment, intellectual establishment, the universities associated with the Ivy League, these institutions did in some ways trace their lineage back to the Puritans. So he was probably partly correct in looking at it that way, although at times it really got away from him as well. But he wrote an essay in 1916, I think, that was actually published, of all places, in the Atlantic magazine, where he talked about Puritanism as a literary force, and that's where he went after this kind of moralism that dominated the study of literature, but also more. And when I taught that piece in American Intellectual History a couple of semesters ago, I was really astounded by how much he was identifying a strain that I think we see today in progressive and or PC and or even woke. I don't like that word, but that's what people call it. A kind of moralism that exists in that world too. It's a never shifting morality, but still it's very black and white. And if you run afoul of those black lines, you get in trouble. And I do think Mencken was onto something about American culture, whether he got it right in tracing it back to the Puritans or not.
Talking with Dr. D.G. Hart about H.L. Mencken and his views on free speech. Mencken is perhaps best known, or very well known, for reporting on the Scopes trial in 1925. What were his views of the trial, his motivations behind covering it? Is there a free speech angle there?
Yes, very much so. He didn't care for the laws in Tennessee that were restricting teaching what he would have called basic science. And it was. I mean, by 1925, Darwinism has been around for over 50 years. The reasons why people oppose Darwinism, which I don't think Mencken acknowledged as much, were partly had to do with eugenics, and the survival of the fittest could very easily be used to keep inferior people from reproducing. And that was certainly what was going on. And if you look at the textbook that John T. Scopes was using, that ironically enough, I think the state legislature had to approve, eugenics were in that. And William Jennings Bryan, who was the lead prosecutor, was very much an anti-eugenics guy and gets a lot of credit these days from even liberal, progressive, somewhat radical historians for taking that stand. But Mencken was concerned about states restricting scientific views, so that was one level of it. But also, I don't know the sequence of when he knew that William Jennings Bryan was going to be the lead prosecutor, but he detested Bryan. One of the worst things I think Mencken ever wrote, where I think his bile just got away from him and it wasn't funny. Bryan died 5 days after the trial. And Mencken wound up writing an article which functioned as a kind of obituary. And it's one of the meanest things he ever wrote. The man wasn't even cold yet, and he was going off like this. But there was something about Bryan, his appeal to the masses. Bryan stood for a kind of the populism and the worst sides of democracy in Mencken's mind. So I think that was another reason for going after this. If people like Bryan were associated with it, he wanted to be against it.
As a huge proponent of free speech, was Mencken an outspoken critic of the Wilson administration and their crackdown on the press during World War I?
He couldn't be. He wanted to be. He was after the fact. But at the same time that he was writing about Puritanism, he went to Germany during the war, World War I, the Great War, as it was then called, and covered some of the war there before America entered. He was sympathetic to the Germans. As a German-American, he was a Germanophile, and he was an Anglophobe. So he had reasons, whether good or bad, for writing the way he did. But he wrote an article that was appreciative of the Kaiser and of the Germans, again, in the Atlantic of all places. But during the Wilson administration, as it became closer to America entering the war, those kinds of views became really objectionable. The FBI opened a file on Mencken, and the editors at the Sun papers decided that Mencken was too hot to handle, and they asked him to stop writing during the rest of the war. So that's one reason why he wasn't critical during the war. He does write pretty viciously at times about Wilson back when he's able to write again. But the blessing, the upside of this, depending on your perspective, but because Mencken can't write at least the way he did during the war, when America enters, he then turns to language. So his books about the American language, which is the differences between American and British usage of English, which is a fascinating philological, linguistic book. I mean, he's not playing it up, trying to ham it up and have lots of jokes in it. He makes some very funny observations, but he kind of plays them deadpan and let the reader decide what's funny or not. But it's an amazing chronicle of the differences between the two. Part of the reason for that is he was following reviews of his books in the British press, and he would see how they used words and whatnot. So it's an amazing gift that Wilson ironically had by indirectly shutting Mencken down, that he turned his energies in this way.
Did he believe in or have any idea about principled limitations of free speech, or would we call him what we say these days as a free speech absolutist? I
think absolutist, at least up to the point of yelling fire in a crowded theater, those sorts of things. And he thought there were so many cockamamie ideas out by various reformers of different stripes, whether it was sex, food, drink. He saw it all. And this was in an era when science was becoming the sort of thing that people followed. You got to follow the science. And he mocked that stuff all the time. But I had no sense that he wanted to shut it down. He just kind of thought this was part of the human experience, it's part of the nature of American society, and let people find out what the truth is by seeing all sides.
Dr. D.G. Hart, Associate Professor of History at Hillsdale College, also the author of the book, Damning Words, The Life and Religious Times of H.L. Mencken. Dr. Hart, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
You're welcome.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Paul Moreno from Hillsdale, talking about Jackie Robinson, Amity Shlaes on Calvin Coolidge, and D.G. Hart from Hillsdale's History Department on H.L. Mencken. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. You can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. The assistant producer of the show is Sam Lair. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.